Hey everyone, so thank you for joining me today. I would love to look at the Lascaux Cave Paintings with you today. And this is a little unusual today, and that we're doing a live stream. Unfortunately, we're having some issues at the moment with the computer that we use for editing. So we've actually recorded this video, but we haven't been able to edit it, to upload it. So I figured, let's just do this together today. Okay, I'm just going to reorient myself a little here. And make sure you can nicely see everything. All right. So let me know if this is a little too dark. I've had some issues with the book being very glossy that we're using here, so I'm not sure if you can see it well. I think it should be okay right now. So you've probably seen images of these caves before. They're really quite famous. There's bulls, stags, horses, bison. And this cave here is in France, in the Dordogne. I'll show you where that is. So there we go. Here we have a little map of France. We have Paris right here along the Seine. We have the Bretagne here, the Atlantic coast, Spain with the Pyrenees here along the border, and a little corner of the Mediterranean. And it's quite obvious where these are here on this map. It's right here. These little dots are all different places where cave paintings or similar art has been found. Hi Jack, that is a nice surprise to see you. I know we're in very different time zones, so nice to have you around. Alright, so Lascaux here is the very first one, right here. This is Périgueux. But then we also have a couple of others. Serchac, Capri Castanet, Labattu, Blanchard, Belcaire, Cellier, Les Cécy, Rouffignac, Le Cabillou, Le Fourneau du Diable, so I think it's the oven of the devil. Could be wrong. The Suillard, Théard, Roc de Serre, etc. There's another one that's quite famous, which is Altamira, which is here in Spain. So these are not just along the Dordogne, but you can also find them actually in the Pyrenees, in this mountainous area, and then here along the Jakobsweg, basically the St. Jacob's Way. Hi Adam, thank you for joining me. It's very nice of you to say thanks. Alright, so with Lascaux, the interesting part is that these are actually somewhat recent discoveries, all things considered. Lascaux specifically was found in the 40s by accident or by chance. There's actually some pictures here. Let's see if we can find them. Right here, there's a photo from exactly 1940. This is the entrance to the cave, a dog somehow found its way in, and the owners followed the dog to retrieve it. And what they found was pretty incredible. There's a couple of different parts to the cave that they found. So it's not just the first room, but you can move deeper in. The main part here is the Hall of Bulls, with one part coming off here and another one continuing in this direction. There's a passageway, a nave, an apsis, named after some church architecture basically. And all the way at the end you get to the Chamber of Felines, which I was excited about. I love cats, so I really wanted to see these. Here's a bit of a bigger image of it. And you can really nicely see where all the different parts are located. It's also quite obvious that the Hall of Bulls is the most impressive area. So here would be the entrance. And then you can see a great number of animals here. They're indicated on the side, but they are in fact not just on the side but also on the ceiling of the cave, some quite high up. So we know that the people back then had to use some kind of scaffolding to get up there because they were too high up to reach. They were also working inside quite a dark cave, so we know they had to have had some kind of light. They probably had little lamps, I'll show you in a moment. And it wasn't probably just from one time, but there's a theory that there's layers to these, so they added more imagery as time went past. Mostly they probably date from around 17,000 years ago, so I saw there are also some theories that these might be older. It's a bit difficult to tell, of course. Our species, so modern humans, are about 200,000 years old, and especially in other parts of the earth, it's quite likely that very old art is going to be found at some point. But of course, as you just noticed, with these caves, they are hidden. And we were lucky to find this one because it was very well protected. But if it's out in the open, it's a bit more difficult to preserve across the ages. Okay, so here we have the passageway. Then the nave with a group here, another group here, some stacks. These are upside down now, but you can see quite clearly what they are. And then all the way at the end we have the feline group. There are about 6,000 figures in Lascaux, which I find really, really impressive. They are not all animals. There's one human in there, in a bit of a mysterious scene. And there are a lot of more abstract parts too, so just some dots, some engravings, where we don't really know if they had a meaning or not, and it's difficult to tell. Of course, there's no one here who could give us a clue. Here's another map of the cave. This is with some modern additions. We can see here, when you go inside, that today you have to walk through 3 different ports. So one at the entrance, then there's one here and one here. However, there's very few people who are still allowed to go in there. Unfortunately, once the cave was found in the 40s, it was open to the public and a lot of people came to see it. There were about 1,200 visitors a day, meaning the temperature rose and there was a lot of condensation, and of course you bring in dirt from the outside, and that caused the colors to deteriorate. There's also an ongoing issue with mold in the caves, unfortunately. So today it's really, really well protected. It's been closed since 1963, so you can't visit the original, but there's a couple copies that you can visit. And we can see that you actually have to walk down in parts. The whole thing is about 250 meters, and there's a difference of 30 meters in height. Especially this part here, the so-called shaft, is difficult to access. You can see there's some kind of a ladder here that you have to climb down. And the same thing is true here. When you get to the Chamber of Felines, there's a little staircase. Kinda unfortunately, I haven't seen that movie. It's possible. I'm gonna look it up later and then I can write it in a comment. Okay, let me just see if you can see this here. I think that's a little better like this. Yeah, the pages are quite glossy and my light's not ideal here. So this is the original entrance, and I find this quite interesting too. We have the original entrance here, and once you walk down into it, it was partly really very narrow. There was only about 1 meter in height, so you had to crawl through. But this has been taken out, and instead they built a staircase, and you can just sort of comfortably walk down, which is a bit odd, honestly. They made quite a lot of changes back then in the 40s and 50s, which of course also took out a lot of material that cannot be, that you can't have a look at today. I quickly briefly lost my train of thought there. So we're missing out on some information because simply the material that they breathed dirt is not there. That would give us some indications of when this was created or what other materials they brought in. Maybe bones, maybe other kinds of tools. Of course, they had to keep the fire going. So it's, I think, really a bit odd when you see it like this. You can see here, this is not the original ground anymore. This is an actual path that was laid in the 40s or 50s, so you can comfortably walk through. It really was intended for a quite large mass of people to enter the caves. But well, it is what it is. What we can also see quite nicely here is that the paintings don't come all the way down to the floor. They're a little further up on the ceiling, but there's still a kind of imaginary floor under them, right here. They're not all on the same line, of course, some are further up. But in a way, they are integrated into the cave, into the surroundings. So they aren't just floating about. They have their place that was well chosen for each of the figures. And here on the side, we have a particularly interesting one. This is called the unicorn, because most of these are actually quite easy to identify. They are clearly horses, clearly bisons, clearly stags. But with this one, people aren't quite sure. So because of its prominent, well, it has two horns, but it's been called the unicorn. And you can also see here in the dark two people with their lights shining onto this part of the cave. I think I've mentioned this book's from the mid-80s, and a lot of these pictures were taken in the early 80s, also as part of a documentary series that was created at the time. I'll see if I can find it somewhere, maybe I can link it. You're really kind with your comments, thank you. Okay. So let's have a look at some of these pictures, because I really, really adore them. I love how they were created. In terms of colors, to me they look very natural. So you have blacks, you have browns and reds, some ochre. I saw my cat just moved in. We'll see if she wants to come up. We have a stag here. Oh, there she is. We have a horse right up here. And of course, at the time in Europe, you had quite a lot of horses. They were wild horses. Probably Przewalski horses, from what I understand. They still exist today in Mongolia. You have a couple of wild herds that were reintroduced. And these might have been the same kinds of horses at the times. There were also tarpans, which is a similar wild kind of horse. They've unfortunately died out. There was a rebreeding program, so today we do have a kind of tarpan horse. It's not quite the same, but it looks similar. And this is very, very close to what they look like. So they would have this standing mane here. They would flop to one side. You can really nicely see the profile. Cat's meowing at me. And they usually have a dark pattern here on the back, which was also included. Sometimes you can even tell that they were depicted in their winter coat because their belly is a little fluffier. Right, we can see a little bit of that here. So the belly is lighter, and then you have some shading here on the bottom. There's another really interesting part to these prehistoric people painted with a kind of perspective. So they would add these horses as they were moving. You can see both of their legs. But the leg that's further away from us here is separated from the body by a little gap. So we get a perspective on the horse. And I think that is really cleverly done. You can also see it here with the hind legs, where we have a dark line here that separates the front from the hind leg, the the leg that's closer to us from the other one. So very, very detailed observations. In this part here we can see some of these more abstract parts, individual dots. And in some other photos we can also see that there are incisions in the rock, so it depends a little bit on the kind of surface, how they worked. Sometimes they would add the minerals directly to the rock, or the pigments. Sometimes they would also mix them with some water or some clay to really create a kind of paint that you could add. And again, I think you can see that they depicted these animals in a very, very lifelike way. Another interesting detail is that at the time in Europe you had bisons and you had aurochs. I think I'm pronouncing these correctly. It's written in the same spelling as in German, but the pronunciation is of course completely different. Both of these animals are depicted in the caves, but they are never together. They're always separate. And the reason for that is probably that they inhabited different kinds of landscapes and did not cross paths. So people living in Europe at the time knew that. They could see that they would, not get too close to one another, and also showed that in their paintings. Horses, on the other hand, or deer and stags, are quite sociable animals, so they are usually depicted with other animals in herds. I saw in some comments that scientists think there are certain kinds of schools that you can identify, so that people passed on their knowledge of how to paint these, and you could tell who learned from whom in a way. And what I also find really, really fascinating is that there are no reindeer in these caves. Or I think in Lascaux there's one. But from findings of bones and other things, we know that people hunted reindeer and ate quite a lot of reindeer. But for some reason, they did not depict them in the caves. So there are theories that maybe these paintings had some kind of ritualistic background, that maybe they were painted in order to bring about good luck for the hunt. But then, of course, if reindeer that were hunted so often are not depicted, that's probably not quite the case. Or, maybe we're missing something. Maybe hunting reindeers was easy, so they didn't feel the need to add them. Here's a little figure that I also wanted to show you. You can see that this is only about 1 meter high. You can see a little person here painting on the side. And this entire part in grey, unfortunately, has been taken out. So today you can just walk in and have a look at these. I'm sure that today that would be a little differently. And maybe you can see this here. These are the engravings on the walls. Sometimes there's also combinations where the outline of an animal would be engraved and then it was filled in with color. sometimes these colors have deteriorated in the meantime and we can't see them anymore, but the outline's still there. There's a good example of that right here. You can see these very, very light patterns in the rock. And then it was filled out with color. And I like that they all look a little fat. This one has really short legs. Here's another really good example of that. You can see the patterns here and here. You can just about see the outline of a horse right here with its eyes and the ears. Alright, let's see if we can find one of those mountain lions. I'd love to show you that one, and then we can move on to the other book that I also find really interesting. There's some more dots. Another kind of abstract part here where we don't really know what it means. You can tell these have been really, really closely studied. And you can see every incision, every line has been copied. There's some stacks here. All right, there are the mountain lions. So I think these are really funny because it's realistic as the horses and bisons look. I would not have realized that this is a cat. I saw somewhere that maybe cats were just really hard to observe. Obviously mountain lions would be hiding, probably also in the caves, so that might have been quite dangerous. But yeah, these look very different. I usually see them described as a more naive style, which I think is quite nice. But there's also a different one where you can just see a little kitty head peeking out of what looks like grass. So it's quite cute. And there's some more here. But there are very few felines depicted, so it might just be that they didn't have the experience. They didn't build a school for that. Will I do more videos similar to the history of Vienna? I could do Berlin, yeah. This sounds interesting. I should do a trip to Berlin sometime to do some research. Okay, I'm gonna have to move the cat to get to the other book. Very sorry, kitty. So part of the reason that so many people went to visit Lascaux is that prehistoric paintings were already famous at the time. This one is a more recent book. Let's just put the other one aside for now. Oh, kitty, come on. So this is an exhibition catalogue from the copies of the Frobenius Institute. Leo Frobenius was a German researcher who in the 30s and 40s went to different parts of Africa to copy these historic paintings that he found there on the rocks. And you can see, for example, here, this is from 1954. This was a book that was covered a year after the exhibition of the same name, called 40,000 Years of Modern Art. So this kind of art also kind of prompted a lot of questions. Obviously in the 19th century and early 20th century, people had this idea of progress, that the human race was always moving forward and developing in a certain way. And at the time, a lot of questions arose over, is modern art actually that modern, or doesn't it have some surprising similarities with this ancient art that was considered to be primitive, sort of closer to our nature, not as developed, which are all ways of, looking at this from a very specific perspective. There's always our upbringing and our ideologies that inform what we see in this kind of art and how we interpret it. And that's also an interesting difference between this book and the other one that I just showed you. The book from the 80s basically starts off with giving us a very clear idea of how these people lived, how their society functions, what kind of culture they had, how they celebrated together, what the men did, what the women did, what the role of the children were. And this one starts off with saying, we have absolutely no idea, and we can't really make these assumptions. We can see what they depicted, we can analyze that, but we can't really say, who went hunting or what the children did exactly outside of the few findings that we have from that period. And I just like to have a look through some of these copies. So these are not originals. These are the copies that the group around Frobenius made when they traveled through Africa. This one here, for example, was created in 1929 by Agnes Schultz and Maria Weiersberg, and it shows art from Zimbabwe, from the Matobo Hills. Again, we have quite a lot of animals depicted here. You can see the horns. So maybe they were some kind of antelopes. This one has a really massive set. But we also see a lot more human figures, like here. Or this one, so these really cute stick figures. And again we see a mix of colors. There might have been some engravings too. This here is Leo Frobenius. Who undertook these travels. Here is depicted with Wilhelm II, so the former German emperor. This is in 1934. And here we can see some images of how they copied the paintings. I find this actually quite fascinating, the way they went about it. And it shows a very different approach than what we saw with the Lascaux Cave. This group of 11 women and 9 men, they weren't just painters, they also had to have an understanding of the landscape, of the kinds of rocks they found. They had to know how exactly to copy the colors that were used, and they tried to create life-size paintings too. So very, very close to the original. They also took some photos because, of course, at the time you already had cameras. However, Leo Frobenius thought that a mechanical approach was not right for it. It was, it couldn't capture the spirit of these paintings, and that was the important thing that they had to do. So we see some of the women here at an oasis in Libya. We have a couple more images of them painting that I'd like to show you. And it's not a surprise that they took these paintings. This was taken in Spain, again Maria Weiersberg and Elisabeth Pauli. And you can see that this was kind of difficult to get to. They had to climb up these rocks in a bit of adventurous manner. And showing these photos also allowed them to raise more funds, because it looked quite fascinating. We can see them here copying images of giraffes, again in Libya. This was taken in 1932. And in South Africa, where they also had an exhibition of the art that they copied. You can see them here, again with these ladders climbing up the rocks to take a very detailed image of it. And they were artists themselves, so they usually created outside of their work for the Institute. Here we see some scaffolding put up. Again, this one's from Spain. This one's from Saudi Arabia, analyzing some of the tools that they found at the sites. And I thought it was quite interesting to read about this team, because of course it was unusual for there to be a majority women on the team. But for them it was probably also an option to escape some of the expectations that were posed on them during the time. And they had the possibility to travel, to have an adventure of sorts here in Egypt, in Libya. But I think it wasn't really an easy job. I particularly like this picture. This is from Tunisia in 1935. And again, in order to raise funds, they organized these exhibitions, for example, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1946. And the tagline reads, "Modern art 5,000 years ago." So I really think a lot of the assumptions that people had at the time were questioned. It wasn't just a simple moving forward and developing in one direction, but rather you could see that you shared a lot with these people that lived sometime in the past, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, maybe even longer. That there's something that makes all of us human, and this artistic idea is a part of that. And we can see some photos from the exhibitions here in Rome. And here Maria Weiersberg with what she called Bushman paintings in Southwest Africa. And I think it also questions a little bit our idea of history. Of course, when we call these prehistoric paintings, we're saying this happened before our time. And it's true, we have very little in terms of documents that tell us what happened at the time. But I think it gets to show that the time that we do know something about is a lot shorter than we might think, or that we might be used to thinking about. And in all of the texts that I've read, people seem to be very moved by this art. But it's these paintings here from the deserts, or paintings surrounding caves, or Aboriginal art that's very old. Can't really look at it and not be moved by it. We don't really have any way of knowing what life was like by then. But of course it's tempting to think that it was somehow in tune with nature, that people were not separate from the world that surrounded them, but that they were part of it and at home in it. And I do like that thought. And I think that's also a good point to finish for tonight. Thank you all so much for joining me. I really like sharing this time with you. And next week you're going to get a normal video again that's been pre-recorded. I will see you all then, and I hope you have a really lovely weekend. If you celebrate Easter, I hope you can take some time off and enjoy the sun. Let's hope it comes out. All right. See you soon.